Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. So as you guys know, the topic of eating disorder recovery was a massive part of my life for about 5 years. It all started when I personally decided to embark on my own recovery journey, and I personally did a self-directed recovery. I first tried to seek professional help, but quickly discovered that that was not going to be beneficial for me in my own recovery. So instead, I found some really valuable resources online and ended up doing a ton of my own research and decided to recover on my own. And through that process, I learned a lot about myself and I learned a lot of things about recovery. And I discovered some things that I thought would be criminal to not share with other people. So that is why I started this YouTube channel. I wanted to share things that I was so desperately looking for when I was in recovery. Because at the time when I was in recovery, there was really not a lot of information on YouTube at all, and I felt like I had to research for hours and hours just to find the information that I was looking for. So instead, I wanted to save people the time and the energy and just share all of the information on one channel that I personally would have wanted to see in recovery. But as you guys know, I'm hoping to sort of move on from this topic of eating disorder recovery, but I sort of have the desire to create a few videos that sort of just summarizes my philosophy of recovery and sort of summarizes everything that I learned over these past 5 years. So I first want to just preface this video by saying that I am in no way a professional, and I've never claimed to be. I never aim to give advice, but rather I aim to share my personal experience, share the research that I come across, and allow people to come to their own conclusions and figure out what is best for them. So just keep in mind that these are my own personal opinions based on my experience and research, and this does not in any way constitute professional advice. So the first point of my philosophy of recovery is on the topic of the importance of nutritional rehabilitation. Some of the criticism that I have gotten is that I have a big emphasis on food, and I think this is because traditionally eating disorders have been treated as purely a psychological disorder. And there hasn't been much recognition of the impact that starvation has on our brain. And what I've personally found and what some studies have shown is that many of the emotional and mental aspects of eating disorders are due to malnourishment. My eating disorder was essentially due to being in a caloric deficit. I didn't start to get any of my eating disorder thoughts or behaviors until I went on my first diet and was dieting over a long period of time. After chronic dieting for years and being in a caloric deficit over a prolonged period of time, that is when I started to experience body dysmorphia for the first time, where I started to see myself as being much bigger than I actually was. I started to become obsessed with exercise, whereas in the past I had never had any obsession over exercise. I started to develop weird behaviors around food, where I would start licking my plate and I would start even kind of doing some really gross things like picking out food out of the compost to eat. I would start to obsessively body check. I would start to obsessively weigh myself. I started relying heavily on caffeine in order to suppress my appetite. I started to experience anxiety for the first time in my life. I started to become quite depressed. All of these things happened after I was in a caloric deficit for a prolonged period of time. And as I nutritionally rehabilitated, as I ate enough calories and got out of a caloric deficit, these mental and emotional aspects of my eating disorder and these eating disorder behaviors gradually disappeared naturally over time as I got out of a caloric deficit. When I went to see my therapist and she wanted me to start relying on a hunger scale and journaling how I was feeling while I was eating, none of these things were personally going to help me recover from my eating disorder. Getting out of a caloric deficit and eating enough food and getting enough nutrients was what was going to help me recover. So that was the main thing for me. So this certainly isn't the case for everyone, but no matter what the reason was for you developing an eating disorder, starvation is going to have an impact on your brain, and it's going to have an impact on your eating disorder behaviors and thoughts. Therefore, I believe it's so important to prioritize nutritional rehabilitation and gaining back your physical health before trying to work on any deep mental or psychological issues. Because in many cases, you might be able to eliminate a lot of the mental and emotional issues just by nutritionally rehabilitating alone. After that point, you can address any remaining psychological concerns. And the study that supports this is the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. They selected 30 young, healthy, mentally stable men who didn't previously have any psychological traits that are normally associated with people who have or develop eating disorders. Yet after a 6-month period of a low-calorie intake and high energy expenditure and weight loss, they all experienced high levels of anxiety, depression, emotional distress, hypochondria, and some even began self-harming. They felt completely preoccupied with food, began to experience body dysmorphia, and even started to socially isolate themselves. So there are profound changes that happen to the brain when we are starved. And it gets better with nutritional rehabilitation. It can be incredibly difficult to try to work through some of these psychological issues when our brain is malnourished. And in fact, many psychological issues can be due to malnourishment in the first place. This is why I have said in the past that if I were to have relied on more conventional forms of recovery, I feel as though I would have been in recovery and reliant on seeing professionals for the rest of my life. Both my psychologist and my dietitian, who specialized in eating disorders, basically told me that I was binge eating in recovery. But what I was actually going through was extreme hunger. And my body was trying to nutritionally rehabilitate. So if I didn't have trust in my body and I tried to stop myself from eating enough food, I would have remained in this malnourished state for probably quite a long time. And I probably would have ended up relapsing because I would have got stuck in quasi-recovery. But of course, keep in mind that I believe that there's lots of really valuable professionals out there, and they do play a very important role, because when you're going through extreme hunger, you're actually at risk for refeeding syndrome, so it is very, very important to keep getting monitored and check in with professionals to make sure that you're safely recovering. So in my case, several months into nutritionally rehabilitating, as I honored my full extreme hunger, when I hit a certain BMI, I suddenly felt so much more like myself again. It was like there was suddenly like a switch where suddenly everything was just more peaceful, my anxiety had significantly reduced, and there's no other way to explain it other than I just felt a lot more like myself again. And over the years, as I continued to eat as much as my body wanted, my body dysmorphia went away. My anxiety significantly went down. My depression, which keep in mind was due to being in a caloric deficit, went away as I became nutritionally rehabilitated. The obsessive food thoughts, the socially isolating myself, the lack of interest in my passions. So all the things that I developed due to being in a caloric deficit went away as I got out of a caloric deficit. However, I did still have to work on some things after I recovered, such as building back up my confidence again, and really working on my personal development, and sort of finding my identity again, because during my eating disorder, my identity felt like it sort of became my eating disorder. So in recovery, there certainly was some mental things to work on, but I don't think I would have made very much progress at all had I still been in a caloric deficit and had I still been malnourished. I had to be healthy physically in order to be able to work on myself mentally. So first and foremost, I believe that calories trump nutrients. However, once I was out of a caloric deficit, I began to realize the impact that nutrients have on my mental health. So not only is the quantity of food important, but also the quality of food is so important for our mental health. The types of food that I eat have an impact on virtually every aspect of both my mental and physical health. And for me personally, the thing that brings out my happiest and healthiest self is a whole food plant-based diet. Eating this way for me was not a way to restrict myself, but rather it was a way for me to support my recovery and support my mental and physical health. I really did not see it as a way that restricted me, but rather allowed me to live my life to the fullest. I really saw this way as such an abundant way of eating, and for me personally was what really supported my mental and physical health in recovery. When I was following a standard American diet, it seemed to always be about eating less and trying to restrict, which is why it was so refreshing when I discovered a plant-based lifestyle. It was all about abundance and eating as much as your body asked for and still feeling really good and amazing and energetic even though you were eating massive portions of food. It was just so refreshing and healing for me to come across this lifestyle. So for me personally, it was just such an abundant and free way of eating that supported me in feeling my best both physically and mentally. So for me, it was in no way about restriction, but rather it was about abundance. And feeling this way and just experiencing how good I felt eating this way, I just felt like I had to share it with other people. But of course, this is yet another controversial topic in the eating disorder recovery community because a lot of people in the recovery community believe that veganism alone is an eating disorder in and of itself. It's very restrictive, it's privileged, even though some of the cheapest foods that you can find are rice, beans, lentils, potatoes, bananas, apples, frozen vegetables, canned foods, literally some of the cheapest foods you can get out there, pasta, bread. All these things are the staples of a whole food plant-based diet, and yet they are the cheapest things that you can find in the grocery store. So for me personally, I just did not see it as a restrictive or an expensive way of eating at all. But it gets super complicated and tricky because everyone is in such unique situations, and it becomes so impossible to say something that is going to apply for everyone. With every single aspect of recovery. So that's why I started saying in every one of my videos, take what resonates with you and discard the rest. Because while the information that I've shared on this channel has been beneficial for many, it's definitely not going to be beneficial for everyone depending on what your situation is, where you're at in recovery, what your lifestyle looks like. So that's why I've always tried to emphasize, take what resonates with you and discard the rest. The next point that I want to make on my philosophy of eating disorder recovery is the power of peer-to-peer mentoring. So as I mentioned earlier, when I started recovery, I saw a dietitian and a psychologist. But even though they both specialized in eating disorder recovery, they both set me back in my recovery. And I quickly recognized that if I was going to recover, I had to do this on my own and find people that were going to help guide me to a full recovery. I corresponded with so many different people online in recovery, and every person that I talked to had some valuable information to share with me. Everyone that I talked to had been through recovery themselves. And I just feel like when it comes to things like eating disorders, you can research them and you can study them all you want, but at the end of the day, that's not going to provide enough information to be able to help someone recover from an eating disorder. The most valuable information that I personally found was from people who went through recovery themselves, which is yet another controversial point because in our society, we're told that professionals have all the knowledge and you have to always talk to a professional. Obviously, for many people, seeing a professional is very, very important for their recovery, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that we cannot dismiss the power of experience and connecting with someone that has been through the same thing that you've been through. Not to mention the fact that it requires a ton of privilege to be able to afford seeing these eating disorder recovery professionals. Over the years of talking to people, many people live in places where there's not any sort of eating disorder recovery professionals anywhere near them. So accessibility, affordability, and privilege are massive things to consider when it comes to telling someone to see a professional in recovery. So we spend thousands of dollars seeing these eating disorder recovery professionals, but the truth for me is that it was the free resources like Tabitha Farrar, Lily from Lilikoi, Hawaii, and the Minimod Method website that contributed to my recovery. Essentially, the three pillars of my recovery were the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, Lily from Lilikoi, Hawaii, and Tabitha Farrar. Taking all of the information from these three resources was essentially the reason for my recovery. And in my experience and hearing from hundreds of other people, professionals can give some pretty bad advice. So we cannot just purely rely on professionals alone. It was so important for me to be able to connect with other people who were going through or have gone through the same thing that I was going through. So there's so many reasons why I think that peer-to-peer support and sharing our personal experiences are so important. The next point of my philosophy of recovery is a point that I already briefly touched on, which is that different things work for different people. I've talked about this in previous videos, but we cannot treat recovery as a one-size-fits-all approach. What seems to be promoted in the recovery community right now is that this is the way that you recover, and if you don't recover this way, then you still have an eating disorder or you're not fully recovered. When the reality is, different things work for different people, and just because someone found something that works differently for them does not mean that they are not fully recovered or that they still have an eating disorder. One example of this is that in the recovery community, what is promoted is that you should be eating in abundance on a standard American diet. And if for whatever reason you don't eat all the foods, then you are not fully recovered because you are still restricting. So essentially, because I recovered on a plant-based diet, I'm orthorexic, I didn't fully recover, and I'm restricting myself. So this is another important point in my philosophy of eating disorder recovery, is that we cannot treat recovery as a one-size-fits-all approach. Just because something worked for you does not mean that it's going to work for everyone. Which is again why I said earlier that you have to take what resonates with you and discard the rest. And finally, the last point that I want to make is that going to extremes is not going to help you recover in the long term. There's a middle ground between chronic dieting, over-exercising, clean eating, versus eating in abundance on a standard American diet, never exercising, and becoming sick from your diet and lifestyle. We want to give up calorie restriction because, as we know, that doesn't work. We want to give up over-exercising because that doesn't work. Yet that doesn't mean that we never exercise again and eat an abundance of food that makes us sick. Over the years, I've seen many people unfortunately go back to dieting after attempting recovery because of the drastic negative health impacts that come from swinging from one extreme to the other. Ignoring science and pretending that there are no negative health impacts from eating in abundance on a standard American diet is dangerous and is not going to help us recover in the long term. For me, the goal of recovery was to gain my mental and physical health back, and I knew that I wasn't going to achieve that goal if I was eating foods that were making me sick. Going from one extreme to the other extreme in eating disorder recovery is only going to cause the pendulum to swing back to calorie restriction in order to bring relief to your discomfort from going to the other extreme. We cannot continue living in extremes and expect to find balance. That is why I promoted what I promoted on my channel, because I wanted to prevent people from swinging the pendulum to the other extreme only to find themselves in another relapse. Finding balance was what was key to me for achieving a long-term recovery and preventing any temptations of relapsing. I'm so sorry that this video is so long, but it honestly feels really good to get all of that off my chest and sort of have a summary video of what my philosophy of recovery is. I feel like I tried to make this exact video in May of this year, but I didn't fully have all my thoughts together, and sometimes I can be really bad at explaining myself, and things that I say can be easily misunderstood. And what happens is when people misunderstand me, I just shut down and say less when I perhaps should be saying more and explaining myself more. I want to thank you guys so much for all of your support over the years, and I'm so grateful that it has benefited so many of you. I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your day. Don't forget to be kind to yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Bye.